Okay, welcome and good evening. It's Tuesday the 15th. It's actually our son's 30th birthday today. We just talked to him on the phone and he's enjoying the day. But I'm glad that you are with us today, wherever you are from, East Coast, Central, Mountain, West Coast. I know the time differences make it somewhat difficult for some of you to hop on, but I'm glad that each of you are with us today, and I'm hoping that you can hear me okay, and eventually I'll share my screen with you in just a short minute. But welcome to this the opening session of a series that I'm calling Traveling Tuesdays. So that's what we're going to do every Tuesday night, probably through October and maybe into November, based on my Israel trip. I'm not sure what's going to happen. My guess is it'll be postponed again in November, but nothing has been decided, and we sort of have to wait until Israel declares open doors for tourism, but that has not happened for months now. So welcome again, and let me now share my screen as we begin our session. Again, if you're just hopping on, please mute yourself. And this is how we're going to proceed. I'm going to put myself in the right corner there. So if you have a question, I want this to be interactive, engaging. So if you have a question at any time in the presentation, just unmute yourself and just shout out a question, okay?
Thank you very much. Good.
Okay, that way we can interact each other, but when you're not talking or don't need to talk, again, please mute yourself, and that would be perfect. So anyway, I'm Pastor John, and some of you know who I am, of course, and others don't. So welcome, old and new friends, once again. So what we're going to do is we're going to travel through the land of Israel and Jordan and Egypt and Turkey and Greece. So this is meant to engage you with the Bible. So we are going to start, of course, in Israel. And we're going to use some of these drone aerial photos that I've sort of enhanced and doctored up, if you will. So, for instance, Beersheba. We'll actually visit Beersheba today. It's in the Negev of Israel, the southern part of Israel. We're also going to fly over and enjoy Caesarea, which is actually on our program tonight as well. Caesarea, as we say it in Hebrew. We're also going to go to Tel Burna or Libna. This is actually an archaeological site, and of course, off the beaten track site, which no groups go to. I excavated here last year. So the intent of this series is not just to take you to common sites. Dead Sea, of course, is quite.
I'm okay. I think if I don't read it,
is quite common, but we're going to. Oh, someone has their mic open. Can I just kindly ask that you close your mic, and let's see. That would be preferable if that's possible. Of course, I think I can do that too. So hold on just for a moment. So if you have an open mic, just mute yourself if that's possible. So thank you very much. Okay, so I hope you can still hear me. So as we are talking about Israel, of course, we're going to go to Jerusalem and talk about biblical connections there. This is a great picture of the Temple Mount, the old city of Jerusalem, the southern excavations that began in pretty much the late 60s, early 70s. The Kidron Valley, and of course the eastern wall of the Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock where the first and second temple stood. All of these connections that we're going to see from not only a drone perspective, but also just an on-ground perspective. We're going to connect the dots between archaeology, history, geography, customs, and culture of the Bible. But unlike other presentations that I've offered, I'm also going to do some other sites in Jordan, for instance. This is the view that Moses had actually from Mount Nebo on a wonderfully clear day, looking at the northern end of the Dead Sea over to Jericho. This was according to Deuteronomy 34, where Moses actually saw the promised land before God called him home at the age of 120. John the Baptist was beheaded in this palace right here on this right side of this structure in a very deep water cistern. So a couple sites in Jordan that we're going to visit together. And of course, Petra. Now, Petra, the Sierra Mountains, or the I guess Seir Mountains is a better pronunciation from the Bible. These are, of course, mentioned in the scriptures, but Petra is the granddaddy site of all of Jordan. So we're going to actually visit Jordan as well. We want to bring these lands of the Bible to you. But I decided actually this morning to also share with you some travel in Egypt. So we're going to see pharaohs like Thutmose III. We're going to visit Luxor, the Valley of the Kings and Queens. This was actually a picture from this past February's trip, where early in the morning, wouldn't you love doing this? I've never done a hot air balloon over to the Valley of Luxor, looking at the Valley of the Kings. But we're going to explore the tombs of kings like this one, Ramses VI, or Ramses IV. Look how colorful these tombs are. These are tombs that are 3,100 years to even a little older than that. So unbelievable experiences as we walk through tombs. We're going to see the Temple of Karnak, the huge pylon, the walls, the pillars. Of course, when we return to Cairo, we'll get a glance at Saqqara. This is the oldest of all the pyramids. There are about 112. I think that's the latest count. It could be 113 or 14 now, but this is how many pyramids have been found since really archaeology began in the 19th century. And of course, the Grand Pyramid, 2.1 million stones make up this Great Pyramid, one of three, technically, here in the Cairo Giza area.
Doing the thing tonight, traveling to Egypt.
And it's about 490 feet high, and you can see it's still intact. So we're going to have fun going to Egypt as well. But I also want to share with you some Greece. And of course, there's all kinds of connections with the Bible here in Greece, like this aerial drone photo of Corinth. In fact, Corinth had about 12 or 14 temples, pagan temples. This is the main one, Temple of Apollo. And Paul was here. He's preached in the Agora. He probably walked on this street that came from the water's edge, the harbor. But we're going to, of course, follow Paul as well as we.
Only Donald Trump can hurt the climate. What?
As we
4 more years of Trump's climate denial.
Well, I don't think we want to listen to any politics tonight, dude.
How many suburban neighborhoods will have been flooded out?
Let me mute some of you here. There we go. Well, my apologies there, but I think that'll quiet us down a little. But anyway, so we're going to fly over Corinth. We're going to actually see an Old Testament site near Corinth called Mycenae. So this is where the Philistines came from, if you remember. So all these connections. Here's Philippi. Of course, Paul preached in Philippi. He was imprisoned here with Silas, if you recall, from Acts 16. So here's the Agora, the marketplace. This is all first century. Paul would have been here, so we want to enter into that world of the Apostle Paul. Paul had 3 missionary trips, as you know. He stopped at Thessalonica on his second trip. Here's the small Odeon, smaller theater, again attached to the agora or the forum, the marketplace of ancient Thessalonica. Of course, he wrote a couple letters back to that church. And then we're going to also spend some time in Turkey, and primarily we're going to look at the 7 churches of Revelation. This is the street that leads down into the main city of Ephesus. Here is that theater. If you remember from the passage in the book of Acts, they gather in this theater and they shout, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." Of course, you can see 1 level, 2 level, and actually a 3rd level of this theater. Although the 3rd level archaeologically did not date to the time of Paul, only 2 of the levels did. So we really can't say the theater was this large with the 3rd upper deck, if you will, the nosebleed section, but it was certainly large enough for 20,000 people, and this is where it happened. So again, a connection with Paul there. Also in Turkey, we have the city of Pergamum, another church of Revelation, and Sardis, the ruins of Sardis. So really spectacular sites. Some of the sites in Turkey, like the churches, Philadelphia and Smyrna, their ruins are pretty limited, but yet we're going to have a great time accomplishing our primary goal, and that is to make as many biblical connections as possible. So this is what we want to do as we begin this Traveling Tuesday session together. And again, thanks for joining us. So the rest of this session is we're going to walk through in alphabetical order. In fact, I'm going to pick out key sites in Israel in alphabetical order, probably over the next 2 sessions. I think we'll accomplish what we need to, exploring and traveling in Israel and making these biblical connections. Tonight, we're going to look at about 7 sites. And there are about 5, 6, 7, 8 slides for each site. But let's make some connections here with the city of Arad. Now, you have to say it in Hebrew like that, Arad, to be proper. Of course, I'm just teasing, but this is a city that's mentioned in the book of Numbers. And we can see at this first picture 2 areas of archaeology. First of all, the lower section that we'll talk about first. This was a Canaanite city. Now, this goes back to what we call the early Bronze period, which actually begins from about 3,500 BC to about 2,100 BC. And this is actually one of the earliest early bronze settlements in all of Israel. And you can see it had some fortification walls that we'll take a look at, and some house structures and a big well or cistern. But here on the top of the Acropolis, as we call it, we have ruins from the Judean period. So much, much later than these ruins. These are about 2,500 BC, or about 4,500 years ago. And these ruins are only about 2,700 years ago, or about 700 BC. So a big difference between the ruins down here, which we see now coming into view. Here's one of the fortification walls, and a close-up of the fortification or structure. Now, Numbers, I think it's chapter 21, tells us that the king of Arad, after Joshua comes into the land, the city of Arad is actually taken. It's conquered. However, after this particular city, that I'll go back to this picture, after it was abandoned in about probably the end of the early Bronze Age, there was no city here. So I really can't say definitively that this was a wall that Joshua saw, because some archaeologists believe that the city of Arad was actually during the time of Joshua, actually moved a little further away from this site. but nonetheless, it wasn't originally a Canaanite city. And these Canaanites, even back in the early Bronze period, had these huge fortification walls. But our focus is on the connections that we can enjoy from looking at what is to be seen on the top of the Acropolis. Now, some of this has been reconstructed for us. However, right here in the middle, we have a temple. Now, what in the world is a Jewish temple doing here in the city of Arad, 70 miles south of Jerusalem? Well, that's the $64,000 question. Beersheba also had a temple, and other locations and sites away from Jerusalem in the divided kingdom also had temples. So this one was here for convenience sake. So these people, these Judeans, actually built a temple. Here's the courtyard. Here you can see what's left of the altar. At Beersheba, by the way, in a short minute, we're going to see another altar that was found there as well in 1960s, late 60s, I believe. But here we have then the inner chamber of the temple and then the Holy of Holies. Now, I'm pointing to this area here, but I find it interesting that just about 6-8 months ago, reading some archaeological news, this Holy of Holies section, and you can see the two pillars here that represent Joachim and Boaz, as mentioned in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 2, and also a mesabah, or a standing stone, here at the back part of this Holy of Holies chamber. Now, if you know anything about Jewish history and Jewish religion, you know that only the high priest in the temple in Jerusalem went into the Holy of Holies once a year on Yom Kippur. Well, here we have a Holy of Holies attached to a temple here where Judean people were just conveniently worshiping Yahweh, God that is, and probably a mix of some paganism as well. So this was a false temple. And of course, when we open our Bibles to 2 Chronicles, let's say 34, and even Hezekiah, 100 years prior to Josiah, also destroyed some of these high places, but primarily it was Josiah. Remember, he was a boy king, and in 2 Chronicles 34, it says that he destroyed the high places. This would be one high place. Now, what's very interesting about this site is what was found here on, or in, I should say, this holy chamber called the Holy of Holies. Now, I'm quoting from Aaron Aria in terms of what was found here: remnants of cannabis and frankincense. What in the world are these two items doing in a Jewish temple? Well, from what we know from all over the ancient Near East and around the world, that many cultures used these materials and ingredients in order to get into some kind of religious ecstasy. Could it be that these Judeans here, with this brand new discovery of cannabis and frankincense, a combination here, were these Judean people here in this temple using this? You can see why kings like Hezekiah and Josiah wanted to simply bring an end to these false temples. Of course, this guy is speaking culturally as an archaeologist, and I think that's quite fascinating in terms of what was now sort of rediscovered after the initial discovery of that high place in Arad. By the way, I forgot to show you this map. I want to point out where these cities are so that you can actually get a good handle at where they're located. Now, the city of Arad is right here. You can see that we're sort of looking at the land of Israel, the southern part of it. In fact, from this point southward is what is called the biblical Negev. So Arad was one of two cities. Beersheba was the other one right here that we'll take a look at shortly. But Arad was certainly a Canaanite city and then a primary Judean city. It fell actually to the Babylonians in 586 BC. Incidentally, as I always do at the beginning of my teaching sessions, I review the length of Israel and the width. Of course, we call this the land of the Bible, the playing board of the Bible, because a lot of, if not most of, the stories of the Bible took place here somewhere on the land. The land of Israel is 300 miles in length, and at its widest point, about right here, is about 75 or 80 miles wide. So Israel is about the size of New Jersey, not a very big state. Of course, it became a modern state in 48, and we know that, of course. But ancient times, it was really the area where a lot of these ancient civilizations, the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Assyrians, Babylonians, you name them, they all came through this land of Israel. So just keep that in mind as we take a look at these individual sites. And secondly here, let's transition into looking at the cliffs of Arbel. Now, Arbel is now back to our map here on the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. So we're all the way to the northern part of the land, and Arbel is not necessarily an archaeological site, although there are some ruins here of what we call a Talmudic synagogue from the 3rd through the 7th century AD. But we're really interested in the cliffs. Now, you can see the cliffs here. And even here, this is from our drone perspective. This is the primary cliff, and here's the secondary cliff with a valley in between. Now, I want to make sure that we notice this valley because Jesus would have walked this valley all the time from Nazareth beyond these hills to the left of the picture, through the valley, and over down along the west and northwest corner of the lake or the Sea of Galilee to places like Capernaum, Chorazin, Beit Shean, Magdala, the plains of Gennesaret. So just know that this territory was used not only by Jesus, this valley itself, called the Valley of the Doves, by the way, but I think that this high mountain is also referenced in the book of Matthew. Let me hold off on that until we actually get to our last slide. So when we, on our trips that I lead, when we hike up this cliff, it's about an 850-foot elevation. It's not a long hike, but it takes about an hour and 20 minutes or so. Look at the view. When we bend the corner, we can now see the Sea of Galilee, the city of Magdala, where Mary was from, the plains of Gennesaret, and around the bend off the picture is Capernaum, and on the north side, Beit Shean. But this is at least our first perspective of the Sea of Galilee. You can see now this top of the cliff and the Sea of Galilee behind us. Looking at this area, that cove there represents Capernaum, Chorazin, and other cities mentioned in Matthew 11, and Beit Shean. These are the 3 cities that Jesus condemned, by the way. But I would think that Jesus spent some time here, maybe not on the top of this Arbel cliff, but certainly in this region of the valley. In fact, when Jesus preaches his Sermon on the Mount here in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, Luke 6 tells us that he preached the same message essentially in the plain. I think it was this plains of Gennesaret here, right below the cliffs of Arbel. So that's a fascinating link, I think, in connection with the Bible. But let me, before I move on, let me also say that I think when Jesus was resurrected in Jerusalem, he tells his disciples to go and wait for them in the Galilee on a high mountain. Could it be this mountain or cliff called Arbel? I think it has some possibilities. It makes sense to me because these Galilean disciples simply returned to their home area. So I would like to think that this also has a post-resurrection connection as mentioned in the book of Matthew. So continuing in alphabetical order, Azekah is how we pronounce this city, Azekah in English. Now we're back into the sort of the western edge of Israel in what we call the Shvela, the Shvela. It's a Hebrew word that means lowlands. And where I'm pointing to is actually between the hill country of Judah right here and the coastal plain right here. So what served as a buffer between these two regions was this area of the Shvela. And here we have 5 valleys that actually extend from the west to the east, and we're looking towards the 3rd valley called the Elah Valley. Once we get into another site, probably in a couple weeks, we'll take a better look at the Elah Valley and, of course, the story of David and Goliath. But here we have an archaeological hill. It's called a tell in Hebrew, in Arabic, actually, called Azekah. Now, this was a Canaanite city, but also a Judean city. Here we can see that not much of it has been excavated, but just take a look at the territory around us. We're actually looking back westward to the coastal plain. So you can see that this area is quite flat topographically. But archaeologically, this is really turning out to be an amazing site. This has been excavated over 100 years ago. And now recently, a team or two have returned to the site over the last 3 or 4 years. In fact, I always tell people when we either go to the top of this site on trips that I lead or when we pass the site, I always tell people that our dear mother, who actually passed away about 5 weeks ago now, she actually broke her leg on this site of Azekah. She was telling us the story. She was walking down the other side of this hill. She broke her leg. She was casted in a hospital in Jerusalem, and she talked about that often. But here we have some archaeological ruins that primarily date to the time of the Judeans, once again, sort of contemporary with the city of Arad. But before we leave these excavations, here again we can see the low hills in the valleys of the Shvela. Now, what's interesting is that this archaeological site in this COVID season was one of only a handful of sites that have been excavated this summer. I wasn't planning to dig here. I was going to dig in Megiddo up north this year. But look at this. This was just discovered, and it's believed to be an Assyrian siege ramp, which was used for the Syrians and King Sennacherib specifically in 701 BC to advance against these fortified cities of Judah. Now, I'm quoting from at least a version of the Azekah inscription, but this is what is said in cuneiform from a tablet that was found in 1903, I believe, in Syria. The city of Azekah, located on a mountain ridge, like pointed iron daggers, without number, reaching high to heaven. Its wall were strong and rivaled the highest mountains by means of beaten earth. Now, that portion was missing in the text, but that's what is suggested as the missing text. But then it does mention ramps, like this one. And in the words of Sennacherib, I captured, I carried off its spoil, I destroyed, I devastated. So this is a city, Azekah, that was captured in 701 BC. Now, I missed this in the British Museum when I had a chance to go there in February, but it was found in, 1903, and is really an amazing text, a source, if you will, a primary source that sort of gives us the language of this Assyrian king when he attacked actually in total 46 cities, according to another inscription. So according to the archaeologist, I cannot prove it conclusively, but there is some evidence to support the idea that the Assyrians used the ancient fortifications as a backbone of their siege ramp. So this is hot off the press archaeological news. In fact, Azekah was excavated by all women this year, Jewish mothers primarily, and they did a great job, and this is really what was discovered. So again, a connection with the Bible, because we know that 2 Chronicles 32, 2 Kings 20, all these passages, even Isaiah 37 that we'll talk about at our next site or two, these were sites that were destroyed by the Assyrians. So that's the link, that's the connection with the Bible. So let's continue with Beersheba. Beersheba, according to most archaeologists, not all of them, was located here on this particular tell. It's a small site. It's primarily all 10th century ruins and later. Of course, look at the topography now. I'll get my map out once again, and here is Beersheba. It's a city, a modern city of about 220,000 now. In fact, I think Kirk Douglas's nephew is the mayor of the city. Go figure. But here we have the ruins of this ancient city. Now let's zoom in on this and see what we can identify. Here, first of all, is the street and the gate structure of the city. Now this was built by Solomon. It was a chambered gate. Some are 3 chambers on each side. This apparently was 2 chambers. This is also a city that was had rounded streets and houses inside. Now, the rule of thumb is that most likely, given the size of the site, a certain number of people lived inside and most of the people lived outside during times of peace. But when the city was sieged, what happened is that people would come inside the city. Here we have the fortification wall of the city. It was actually what we call a casemate wall, a double wall. But take a look at these 4 pillars here. I'm going to zoom in here on the picture and talk about a typical Israelite 4-room house. These have been reconstructed for us, but these pillars would have supported a second floor, if you will, of the house itself, with one room here of the house, another maybe over here, another over here, and another one on the second floor. A typical Israelite 4-room structure. So we have several of these here at Beersheba. But we also have a well. Now, when you take a look at Genesis 21, Abraham was here. He made a treaty with Abimelech, the Philistine. Now, the word Beersheba means well of the oath, or the well of 7. Unfortunately, this well and the trough that's connected to it does not date to the time of Abraham. Abraham was about 2000 BC. This well maybe dates to about 1000 BC, but probably much later. It's a very deep well. It's about 50 or 60 feet deep. What the residents of Beersheba did when this well was in operation was that they reached the aquifer down below and certainly just used that as a water source. Some of the water they diverted into a cistern system that we won't see in this presentation. But here's a trough, and I always like to think of this trough as a cup. Now, when we think of shepherds and flocks of sheep and coming to wells like this, I think of what a shepherd would do. A shepherd would, of course, draw water from the well, and then with a bucket, he would fill this trough to overflowing. And of course, this would be attractive to the sheep or the goats. They would drink and drink and drink as long as the shepherd would keep water in the trough. Or again, let's use this term cup. Now, again, shepherds, sheep, water. Think of Psalm 23. My cup overflows. I love this image of a shepherd who keeps the cup overflowing so that the sheep and goats can drink as much as they want. That's really a great picture, is it not, of how God overflows to us his grace and love and goodness. And as long as we are thirsting for him, the cup continues to overflow abundantly. I love that image, and maybe a life lesson for us tonight as we take a look at the well. Getting back to the time of the patriots, by the way, Abraham was here, Genesis 21. Jacob was here, Genesis 26. And Isaac, in chapter 26. And then later on, Jacob at the end of the book of Genesis. I think it's chapter 49. So we have some connections here with Beersheba, with the patriarchs. Also, 1 Kings 19 tells us that Elijah was here, the prophet of Elijah. Now, in the late 60s, this particular altar was found, just like the sacrificial altar at Arad that was found. Unlike that one, I should say, this one actually had horns. Now, we can look at scripture in terms of the altar that was used in the days of Moses in the tabernacle at Shiloh, and then of course finally in the temple in Jerusalem built by Solomon, first of all. But this altar had horns. And of course, these four corners are mentioned frequently in the Bible, as you can see. But this was found in secondary use. Little bits and pieces of these stones were used in later centuries, but they determined that this also was an altar, and therefore this must also have been a false worship center used by Judeans, and a temple that, of course, kings like Hezekiah and Josiah brought to an end in the religious reforms that they did. So that's Beersheba. Let's move on to another site as we sort of take off some of these sites one by one in alphabetical order. Now, Beit Shean is one of the most spectacular sites. It's right here. It's about 20 miles south of the Sea of Galilee. It's right in the Jordan Valley, as you can see, extends from the Sea of Galilee all the way down to the Dead Sea. The Jordan River flows north to south about 75 miles. But here we see a massive Roman city. Now, we're not going to go in detail here, but you can see the colonnaded streets. Underneath this canopy are the Roman bathhouses. Now, every Roman city, whether it be here in Jordan, the Decapolis cities, in Turkey and Greece, they all had the same thing. There was an agora here, or a marketplace. There was a public latrine over here. Every city needs the public bathroom, right? And a small Odeon here. And, of course, a theater. This is, I think, one of the most spectacular theaters discovered. Now, when this site was excavated in the 80s and 90s, primarily using about 300 unemployed Israelis, by the way, back then, only the top of this theater was exposed. Everything else in the rest of the city that we saw was all underground. And yet, archaeologists over the course of a good 10 years or so uncovered it all. And now you can see an intact theater, complete with what is called a skene. It was sort of the back of a theater. And keep in mind, the theater is not an amphitheater. An amphitheater would have had another rounded structure over here. Amphi means two, which means like a coliseum. Israel actually has only two amphitheaters, and one was discovered here at Beit Shean, but this is strictly a theater. And of course, there was an upper level here as well. So perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 people fit here in the theater at once. And that tells us that the city, in terms of its population, was probably, as the rule of thumb goes, 10 times bigger than what the theater could seat. So that means if this could seat 7,000 people, that means the city was about 70,000 in population. Now, would Jesus have come to this Roman city? No, he would not have. He would have not come to any Gentile city like this, even though it was massive and certainly very, very attractive in terms of its mosaics, its buildings, its architecture, and all of that. So here's another perspective again of the colonnaded street. Look at these columns, of course, all reconstructed for us today. The only one that was standing was this one right here. In fact, you can see the dirt mark, not in this picture, but when you pass by it on the site, you can see the dirt mark that really exposes to you what was underground before it was discovered and what was left to nature and wind and erosion and everything like that. But a great perspective. But let's now talk about a biblical connection, because in 1 Samuel 31, we have a guy named King Saul, who about 7 or 8 miles to the west died on Mount Gilboa. And Mount Gilboa was a high hill. He actually dies there, and they bring, the Philistines, that is, they bring his body to the Old Testament site of Beit Shean, and they hang his body on the walls of the city. This is the Old Testament site of Beit Shean. Notice that all of this wasn't here yet, of course. All that was here along the Jordan Valley, which we can now clearly see, is the hill or the tell of Beit Shean. This was actually controlled for centuries by the Egyptians. So let's fly up and over it. I guess we can't see too much of the ruins here. They're not very impressive, believe me, but at least from the side of the slopes of the city of Beit Shean, we can look down to the Roman city. So Saul was hung on the walls here, and then the people from Jabesh Gilead, actually from a little over this way to the south, to the right of the picture, they come and rescue the body of Saul and take it back to Jabesh. So a wonderful view of this huge city. Before we leave Beit Shean, let me just make a possible connection with one of the parables that Jesus shares. Remember, in the book of Luke, Jesus shares the parables of lostness, the lost son, the lost sheep, the lost coin, and then, of course, the prodigal son, the lost son. I think it should be actually more appropriately called the parable of the compassionate father. But you know, in that parable, one of the sons wishes his father dead because he wants half of his inheritance and he wanted it now. So that was basically saying the same thing. I want my dad dead. So he took his part of the inheritance and he squandered it in probably a very Gentile city like this one. Now, I'm not saying that this was the city where this prodigal son went to, but most likely it was a city like this. And of course, he comes to his senses. He walks back, I should say, to his father, and then his father runs in an undignified manner and greets his son. He befriends him. He loves him, throws a big feast. It's a wonderful parable of the compassionate father. Incidentally, in the Jewish circles of literature, rabbinic literature, there's a very closely related parable that the Jewish rabbis would also share. And yet what Jesus did incidentally in that parable was that he sort of tweaked the ending. He often did that, by the way, for sort of a shock and awe surprise ending. And yet maybe at a site like this, we can picture it happening here with the prodigal son. Let's move on to Beit Shemesh. We already took a look at Beit Shean. This is now Beit Shemesh. A very small site here on one side. This is Roman ruins here. But here we have the Sorek Valley. Once again, we're in the Shfela of Israel, and we're about right there on the map. It's west of Jerusalem, about 20 miles or so, maybe a little longer than that, a little further than that, should I say. But notice that this ridge back there, I'm pointing this out because right on our side of the ridge, about right here, is a city called Timnah. And behind this ridge is a city called Ekron. Let me illustrate by going to this map that I made. Here, Beit Shemesh is the site that we're at. And I didn't mention Zorah yet, but hold on. Here's Timnah, and here's Ekron. So not a long distance from Beit Shemesh are these two cities. Incidentally, the Philistines lived in these two cities. In fact, Samson's first wife lived here. She came from Timnah. And Samson, in Judges chapter 13 through 16, was from Zorah. So if we go back to this picture, Zorah is just right off the map, here off the picture, I should say, and Timnah is right there. Samson simply walked down the valley, maybe 3-4 miles, and met his first wife. That's how important it is to understand distances and what we call proximities. Samson lived very, very close. Here's another picture of Beit Shemesh and Zorah and how close Timnah was. Now, that's, of course, one biblical connection with Samson. The other connection is with what would happen in 1 Samuel chapter 6 in the Ark of the Covenant returning from the city of Ekron to Beit Shemesh. Hold on to that thought. We'll get to it as we take a look at these ruins. Now, look at this road. These ruins, no doubt, go all under this modern road. It's called Route 38. And engineers want to widen this road, actually. There's a big battle between the engineers and the archaeologists in terms of what to do. They're not going to widen it because they're going to be ruining, no pun intended, more excavation opportunities underneath this road. I'm hoping that they get rid of the road and divert around it. But look at all the excavations that have been found just in the recent few years. No doubt, last 3 or 4 years at most. But one is among these ruins. You can see how carefully excavated this has been. You can see structures, some bulk walls still standing. These are what archaeologists use to make their 5-meter squares, but you can see the stone structures here as well. But let me take you to a picture by the Israeli Antiquities authorities, the IAA, the Israeli Archaeological Association. And here they found something like this. It's a big stone. It's round. And of course, what is it? Much of archaeologists is in how you interpret it. Israeli Antiquities Authorities. I'm sorry, I misspoke just a minute ago. That's what IAA stands for. And yet this archaeologist from Tel Aviv interprets this way. There's a lot of evidence that this was indeed a temple. That's interesting. When you look at the structure and its content, it's very clear that this is not a standard domestic space, but something special. He would suggest that this dates to the 12th century or so BC, at the time of the judges or so. And he continues, it is clear that at some point in the mid-12th century BC, the temple was desecrated, the pottery within it smashed to bits. When uncovering the remains, the archaeologists had to dig through a thick black layer, which they initially thought was ash, but turned out to be animal dung. The site had been turned into a byre after being captured. Now, what in the world is this doing here? A temple. And what's the significance of this big stone? Well, this is what the archaeologist does. He interprets this stone as perhaps where later on the 1 Samuel 6 story, where the Ark of the Covenant was placed. Now, I'm not sure I go this far to make the connection, but here's the text of 1 Samuel 6. If you know the story, people are Beit Shemesh are reaping their wheat in their wheat harvest in the valley, I should say, and they lift up their eyes and they saw the Ark of the Covenant. They rejoiced when they saw it. When the cart came into the field of Joshua, Beit Shemesh, and stood there, a large stone was there. The Levites took down the ark of the Lord and put it on the large stone. Could it be that this large stone was then somehow reused in the temple? We're not sure. This is the theory, but it's an interesting one. But we'll just have to leave it at that, whether we can jump that far with that conclusion. Certainly, the Ark of the Covenant was returned to this city of Beit Shemesh in an amazing way. If you want to read that passage from 1 Samuel 6, later on, I would suggest this. Let's go to Libna. Libna, we have just a couple more sites left. We have a reference to this small site. Joshua actually fought against Libna early on in the conquest of the land. I actually excavated here last year, so you can see the canopies, the shade canopies, and the open areas where we actually dug through the ruins. We also know from 2 Kings 8 that Edom revolted against Judah, but so did Libna. So this city revolted in the time of the divided kingdom. This is actually where I had a chance to dig, and let me take you to that dig. What we found were a couple interesting things. We found some 8th century fortification walls and gates. In fact, I worked on this gate here. There's a drainage channel underneath this gate. So here you can see a city wall, an outer wall. Here's another earlier wall from perhaps the 10th and 9th century. I actually worked on that wall as well and exposed all of these stones. So we know that this city was Canaanite, although these ruins don't right here date to that time period. But later on, it was a Judean city that, just like Lachish and Azekah and Arad and all these other cities, they were destroyed by the Assyrians. So here we're working diligently on the opening part of the gate. I'm working on the drainage channel and exposing some of the dirt that was covering there. And then here's the drainage channel, all cleaned up after a day's work. So all of this dates to the time of the divided kingdom, the Judeans. And now part of the fortification wall. There's Dr. Chris McKinney, who was the one of the archaeologists working here. In fact, in that wall, I found a sling stone. No doubt an Assyrian sling stone, because we know that, according to Isaiah chapter 37, that after Lachish was destroyed by Sennacherib, one of 46 cities, Libna was also destroyed. And they used many, many stones like this. So I found this one actually lodged in the wall of the city. So it didn't quite reach or penetrate a human being, but it got lodged in the wall, and we found it 2,700 years later. That's quite amazing. But look at the beautiful topography of the lowlands, or the Shvela, these low hills and valleys, looking up to the hill country of Judah to the east. It was a wonderful day one of these mornings when we took the drone up and just enjoyed it. So our last site, I think it's our last site, is Caesarea or Caesarea. And here we have a city that's mentioned in Acts 9, Acts 10, Acts 12, Acts 26. Actually, Acts 21 as well. I'll explain in a minute. So we're looking sort of north from the south, the theater that we'll see over here to the right in a minute is right here. In fact, there it is. Let me just show you this theater first before we go to the other things. Again, reconstructed in this case, unlike Beit Shean, probably could hold 4,000 or 5,000 people. But this was a theater that's quite significant. But now with the theater to our right, we're looking now northward to the palace area. When Peter was here in Acts 10, by the way, he probably knew this city well. He befriends a man named Cornelius. He and his family, by the way, become believers. The palace of Herod the Great. This was a city built by Herod the Great beginning in 22 BC. It took him 12 years through about 10 BC. But the palace was not just this area here. It was also extended out into the Mediterranean Sea. Believe it or not, this was a freshwater swimming pool right here. So go figure, this Herod the Great guy was a great builder and even built a freshwater pool as a part of the palace area. Now, later on, when Paul was here, he would return, by the way, after his third missionary journey, and really his second one, incidentally. But after the third one, he stayed with Philip, who lived here, probably for 20 years. This is the same Philip who befriended the Ethiopian eunuch. But then in Acts 26, Paul stays here for 2 years. He's in prison, or at least confined to an area, before he would sail to Rome. But probably in this area of the palace is where Paul was for 2 years. Here's a close-up of this pool. If you look very closely, the diving board was right there. I'm just kidding, of course. But an amazing discovery. A hippodrome, although Josephus called this a stadium, but a hippodrome is where they raced chariots. You can see how long and narrow it was. You can see these are intact benches, if you will, for the audience. Of course, here on the west side, they're all washed away from the storms of the Mediterranean. And then out here, beyond this little piece of land, out here, extending about right in this area, was the ancient harbor where Paul would sail at least 3 or 4 times in and out of this harbor. It was the most magnificent harbor in the area. Now, this city didn't have its fresh water locally, so they had to literally bring it in from about 5 or 6 miles away. Herod built an aqueduct. If you can see very closely here on the right-hand side of the picture, there are some hills here. It's called the Mount Carmel Range. In this vicinity is where there are some springs. So what did Herod the Great do? Is he built an aqueduct, and he brought fresh water 5 or 6 miles away and channeled it on this aqueduct. Quite amazing in his engineering. So that brings us to our conclusion of our session tonight. I'm going to try to keep it to 45 or 50 minutes. I think we're about 50, 52 now. So my apologies if it's a little longer, but again, thanks for joining us. And you can see our next session is next Tuesday. It's going to be every Tuesday, of course. We'll meet again at the same time, and you'll have to register for this. So anyway, I'll say goodbye, and I'll hang on here for a moment if you want to hang on also and ask any questions that you may have. I'll be happy to correspond and share with you some back and forth about any questions that you might have. So let me say shalom, shalom, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Okay, thanks, and see you next week.